If you want to support the channel on Patreon and other forms of social media, links are in the description below. You know what, the games industry sure does suck at a lot of things. No matter how good the games might be at any given time, there's always going to be something to complain about. It could be irritating exclusives, or microtransactions, or various dodgy practices. But there is one thing that remains evergreen. The games industry is shit at taking care of their old IPs and preserving their classics. Think of the folks at the BBC who taped over all those old episodes of Doctor Who from the 1960s and multiply it. Realise that there are games from the last generation, officially released ones at that can barely be played now, certainly not through official means. Or games where the source code literally ended up in the trash. Or others where the entire IP is an absolute mess of crap wherein no one knows just who owns the rights to what, and frankly the people who do own the rights don't care enough to do anything about it. Such is the case with today's series, featuring two games that are often regarded as two of the greatest PC games ever released. Untying the Gordian knot that is the status of No One Lives Forever is no mean feat, and it is something that we're going to try to do closer to the end of this video. But first off, I just want to go back to it. The appetite for this game is still pretty strong, even though it's getting close to, Jesus, 20 years old. Horror at advancing age aside, this is a game that people still love. Good thing too, as it's thanks to people who love the game that it's still playable on modern computers, regardless of where it stands. It's one of the top games that people always clamour for in terms of a re-release or a revival. There are people who would quite literally kill to step into the high heels of Cate Archer once again, whether in a new adventure or a remastered edition of the old ones. Perhaps because, well, I'm not sure if there's really been another game quite like it. So why exactly is this game so freaking good? The brass tacks of the game are quite simple. No One Lives Forever was released by Monolith for the PC in 2000. The game spent a good couple of years knocking around in development, with things getting serious after the release of their previous game, 1998's Shogo Mobile Armor Division. One of those games that tries to do a ton and is the very definition of interesting but flawed. Monolith recognised this and wanted a game that kicked on from their previous efforts, producing a tighter, more intelligent package that learned from Shogo's mistakes. And so in comes this action stealth FPS with a big old spy bent. Now spies made a triumphant return to call in the mid-late 90s, with efforts ranging from the classic and serious to the hilariously parodial. I think that the success of everything from the revivals of James Bond and Mission Impossible to Austin Powers is reflected in games as a whole, let alone just this one. It's no surprise that Monolith would try and do this sort of game, although they tried to go for less obvious sources than, say, the modern adventures of 007 or the ridiculous machinations of Dr. Evil and company. Instead they reached back to more classic efforts such as the Owlman Flint series, The Saint, and Get Smart. It's also perhaps not surprising that originally the protagonist was supposed to be a bloke. However, Monolith very much intended for the game not to be just a straight up riff on Bond, who had especially managed to sink his hooks into games thanks to, well, you know, one of the most popular and critically acclaimed licensed games ever. They did kind of find the male protagonist to be kind of limiting in this regard, and so it was gender swap time. The introduction of Cate Archer not only helped to give the game a more unique stand-in, but also allowed for much more creativity in terms of fun gadgets and the like, which you definitely see in the game. The production was expensive, especially seeing as it included the production of a whole new engine in Lift Tech. It took quite a while to find a publisher, and the dev cycle at points did leave Monolith weeks from the receivers, but ultimately Fox Interactive jumped on board, and the game, complete with the full title of The Operative No One Lives Forever, was released in November 2000. Upon its release, it was immediately classed as one of the best first-person shooters since 1998's Half-Life. Anyway, it's the 1960s and you play as Cate Archer, a well-to-do, sophisticated lady and former cat burglar who works for the British counter-terrorism organisation Unity. She does have one thing in common with Bond. She's Scottish. Not that you would particularly know from the accent. The character's Scottish accent was more pronounced early on, but it was soon changed to something more generic British and posh.
You're not going to kill her? What if she wakes up?
Now look here, you. I'm not going to butcher a fellow countryman without a specific grudge. If she wakes up, she can fend for herself. If she dies, then she ain't really a Scot, so I won't feel bad.
You control Cate for a whole bunch of missions, with an overarching story joining them all together. Now first off, well, Cate is pretty obviously an awesome character. The design alone, that hair and ultra-garish catsuit, make her very memorable indeed. She carries explosives in lipstick and poison gas in bottles of perfume, has no end of sass and is more than ready for a fight. She's pretty awesome without trying too hard for it. She certainly fits right into the game's world, which is that classic hyper-real vision of the 60s, much like what you'd find in Austin Powers. The difference being that while Austin Powers is obvious parody, Monolith tried to make No One Lives Forever a little bit straighter. The actual story and themes are a bit less of a parody. So what you end up with is basically a good old whip-cracking spy yarn. Many a great character and many a great scene. There's tons of 60s references, and Monolith's love for the decade and all the classic spy works they researched is clear. It's pretty clear that they can write a damn good game too. While it's not strictly a parody, that doesn't mean that the game isn't funny as hell a lot of the time, almost having that LucasArts vibe to it. The story itself revels in its cliched nature. Cate is frustrated waiting for her first mission, she finally gets her chance, and the entire thing is a botch job wherein both the person that they were supposed to protect and her mentor end up Costa del Blowfly. She escapes, and despite the dim view taken of her by her bosses, she ends up on more missions as, well, she's the only choice there is. And from there she proves herself and ends up taking on Harm, the big villain organisation hell-bent on taking over the world. It's your classic introduction origin story, but plenty of fun for it and full of intrigue. The action itself is chock full of set pieces too. No One Lives Forever definitely plays a lot at offering more than just typical shooting action. You've got vehicle sections, shooting galleries, clue hunting, the famous skydiving without a parachute section, and even a part where Cate ends up in frickin' space. Yeah, the game does get rather extreme by its finale. There's a lot of these, of course, being that this is an early 2000s game and such drastic changes in gameplay were commonplace. But the core itself is just fine. The action itself is as sharp as any classic FPS from the time, not one at all with the controls, perfectly easy to shoot folks and lots of good gunfights. There isn't anything about the gunplay which especially stands out aside from the aforementioned set pieces, but it's absolutely fine. The stealth is where things get a bit more interesting, of course. No One Lives Forever does have a fair bit in common with another all-time great FPS that was released in 2000 and is somewhat more available today, Deus Ex. While No One Lives Forever lacks that game's RPG-style levelling system, both games utterly revel in gadgets and the virtues of being hidden in plain sight. And if a barrette that doubles up as both a lockpick and a poisoned dagger sounds awesome to you, you've come to the right place. Not to mention the aforementioned explosive lipstick, using a cigarette lighter as a welder, or simply disposing of bodies with a quick spray that'll disintegrate the unfortunate cadaver in seconds. The multitude of gadgets offers a bit of replay value too. One of the big parts of the game is collecting as much intel as you can. Not only does it add to your score, but a lot of it's genuinely worth seeking out as it adds more to the story, while again being quite amusing, much like the funny conversations you often get to eavesdrop on. You won't be able to get close to all the intel at first as you'll lack the required gadgets, but after earning items like the mine detector or belt hook shot, you'll be able to replay levels, find the secrets, and hopefully improve your score. This certainly does add a bit of replay value, along with items often being in different places when you replay the missions. Problems? A couple of typical ones for sure, often relating to the stealth, it has to be said. The game's stealth is very early 2000s, the sort where guards often seem to have supernatural abilities when it comes to spotting you, meaning that you can't so much as peek around a corner without being seen. Sneaking in FPS games was pretty rough back then, and you obviously get a lot more feedback now when it comes to how hidden you actually are. Now while it's not the end of the world if you mess up stealth, it is somewhat annoying to then go through whole missions with alarms blaring and what have you. It's like a sudden switch to a wholly different game. Other than that, the game's AI isn't super smart or anything, and you can pick them apart from a distance with most of your weapons. The game's not exactly super hard in the regular settings, and should be a breeze for anyone who's competent at FPS. Still, this isn't so much a game you look at for a challenge as much as you do for the variety and the fun that's on offer. Again, it's quite a lot like Deus Ex in that regard, only with a snappier script and more killer one-liners. If you want to forego stealth entirely and just go in there all guns blazing, there's nothing stopping you, it's not mandatory. Nor do you have to obsess over score and getting all the items, you can just revel in the story instead. It's a pretty great game no matter what you decide to do, full of vibrancy and charm, sparkling with wit, a truly romantic spy yarn. Basically the opposite of Floor 13, but bloody marvellous. The original No One Lives Forever was, thankfully, an unbridled success, loved by all just about. A sequel was pretty much inevitable, and it would arrive in 2002, No One Lives Forever 2, A Spy in Harm's Way. Following on a year from the events of the first game, the much more experienced Cate Archer is set to be a part of frosty US-Soviet relations once again, while thwarting Harm's attempts to set the world afire and, as usual, having something of a smart mouth ready for villains and employers alike. No One Lives Forever 2 is, as it turns out, yep, pretty damn good again. A fair bit darker than the original game in many ways, the stakes become a fair bit heavier in this one. The snappy dialogue and humour is still very much there, of course. You'll get plenty of funny notes and conversations, much like in the first game, but you'll also get plenty of drama and serious peril. Hell, the first mission ends with our heroine nursing a stab wound, close to death. Now obviously she survives, it wouldn't exactly be much of a game if she didn't, but while Cate is now a seasoned veteran, she's hardly invincible. The game also smooths out a lot of the original's rough edges. You get a lot of technical improvements and refinements. The stealth, one of the weaker points of the original, is greatly improved. Cate can now lean around corners and have a peek at what's going on without risking immediately getting spotted. There's a great deal more ways to distract, incapacitate or otherwise kill enemies. I mean, in the original you basically had the option of either evading or killing, and now if you want to play as pacifist as possible, it's a lot easier. You can knock an enemy out and get rid of their weapons before they wake up, for example. Tracking enemies is now also an important part of the game. You can mark enemies with a special gun and they'll appear on your compass. The body remover from the first game is also gone. While quite a fun and unique gimmick, its limited usage did at times make it a bit of a pain. So now Cate's grown a bit more muscle since the last game, and she can drag bodies out of the way so that they don't get spotted. And also you have an idea now of how well hidden you are. It's much more polished. The gunplay itself hasn't changed much, and you still get most of the awesome gadgets, plus a few new additions. These were all great things about the original, and they've not really changed. The ability to lean, if anything, improves them too, and the AI is a little bit smarter, even if it's not necessarily the brightest by today's standards. There are some other little accoutrements that can be handy. You have a compass now, which gives you an idea of where you need to go, and you also have skill points to increase Cate's skills even further. Now these are more like bonuses. It's not like, say, Tomb Raider Angel of Darkness, where seasoned explorer Lara Croft is suddenly too weak to pull a bloody lever, but it turns Cate from a pretty darn good spy into a super spy by game's end. A lot of these improvements may sound familiar, and I think it's fair to say that No One Lives Forever 2 is in many ways highly inspired by Deus Ex. The original was Deus Ex's contemporary, of course, both arrived in the same year, and the sequel is more than happy to take lessons from it. Not that there's anything wrong with taking notes from one of the best FPSs of all time, mind you. There's even more of an effort to fill levels with multiple paths that allow for far more interaction with NPCs, that are filled with lots of intel and other secrets to find, and also feature plenty of side objectives away from the typical ones that you have to do. The original was a much more direct game, focused on set pieces, and while No One Lives Forever 2 has plenty of that, it also often tries to make its levels into expansive, living and breathing hubs. The aforementioned skill point system, one that was popularised by Deus Ex, is also a clue. NOLF 2's isn't as in-depth, but it's certainly there. In the end, if you like Deus Ex, and who doesn't, then you'll certainly like this. Hell, you could almost say that NOLF 2 is a fine sequel to Deus Ex, in a way that Invisible War was not. You know, if you completely change the protagonist, setting, and time. The much more expansive levels and improvements in just about every area definitely make No One Lives Forever 2 a keeper. It's everything you would expect from a damn fine sequel, no doubt about it. Monolith kept up with the times. The differences between this game and the first are actually a convenient way to show just how quickly the first-person genre was evolving, as the series had come so far in just 2 short years. It was rightly praised to high heavens again, even going as far as to win the title of PC Game of the Year in a couple of publications. No One Lives Forever had been such a great title for Monolith too. Previously, games like Blood and Shogo had shown their potential, even if they came with the odd flaw, but with these 2 games, they'd released their first stone cold classics, and they had cemented themselves as one of the bigger developers going, and a pretty hot one too, a title which they still hold today. No One Lives Forever is a big part of that. Indeed, what did happen next? When you've got such a hot series on your hands, you would expect to see more. And there is one more game that took place in the universe, Contract Jack, released in 2003. Jack, standing for Just Another Contract Killer, puts you in the shoes of John Jack, an assassin working for harm and dealing with another criminal organisation known as Danger Danger, and the events of the game take place between the 2 No One Lives Forever games, with basically no involvement from Cate Archer or Unity. Spin-offs where you play as the evil team can be fun, but alas, TIE Fighter this is not. The game didn't really succeed. It was somewhat more simplistic than the excellent NOLF 2, the characters and humour weren't as good. It didn't make much of an impact. No matter though, it's just a spin-off and surely the adventures of Cate Archer would continue. But no, this is actually the last game set in the No One Lives Forever universe. So why did the series come to such an abrupt end? The main duo who'd produced the game, Chris Miller and Samantha Ryan, were certainly fond of it, especially Chris. In 2004, Monolith were acquired by Warner Bros. Interactive, and from then on they would release titles under the WB Games label. Their first game, The Matrix Online, a co-production with Sega, was not exactly a hit, alas, but their second game was. Fear, released in 2005, was the start of another hugely successful and critically acclaimed series. They also released Condemned, an excellent Xbox 360 launch title, in the same year. Suddenly they'd switched from spy capers to serious survival horror. One thing to note about Monolith is that they aren't the biggest developers around, nor are they the most prolific. Years can pass from one proper Monolith game to another. So perhaps Fear set them on a new path, one where No One Lives Forever just fell by the wayside. This policy of fully devoting themselves to 1 or at most 2 games until they're done tends to pay off for them. After years away, a time when you would almost have forgotten that they existed, they came roaring back again in 2014 with Middle-earth Shadow of Mordor, another hugely loved and mega popular title. So this is not a story where the developer ended up abruptly closing its doors. Monolith were and are a big name in the industry. If there was to be a third No One Lives Forever game, theoretically they could work on it. The weird status of No One Lives Forever, in the end, all comes down to rights. It turns out that the rights to the game are a massive melting pot, filled with existing entities that barely talk to each other, most of whom have no idea about the actual status of the game and lack the motivation required to sort things out. It's not like people aren't interested. The company Night Dive, one that specialises in taking old games, giving them a bit of a prim, and then re-releasing them on sites like GOG.com, applied for the trademark to No One Lives Forever in 2014, confident that getting it sorted wouldn't be much of an issue. The source code for both games had long been out there for a start, and anyone who'd developed the game was well up for it. All was good, until they came across a quite ridiculous trifecta. 3 big companies, all of which potentially had a claim to the IP. It was enough for Night Dive to ultimately give up on re-releasing No One Lives Forever, sadly deciding it was a lost cause. So yeah, it's not good. What is this trifecta then? Well, first off, I have to give credit to Kirk Hamilton, who wrote a piece for Kotaku called The Sad Story Behind a Dead PC Game That Can't Come Back in 2015 about the series. He's done the necessary digging in order to try and determine the quite unfortunate status of the IP, and his article will very much be our guide. I mean, when someone's done such a sterling job, it would be foolish to not give praise where it's due. Anyway, the big three are Warner Brothers, you probably guessed that one, 20th Century Fox, who had a hand in publishing the first game, and Activision, who, well, they didn't have any involvement in the series at all, but were potentially involved due to their merger with Vivendi in 2008, who purchased Fox Interactive, the actual publishers of the first game, in 2003. Seeing as Warner Brothers own both Monolith and the Liftech engine that the games were made on, naturally Night Dive went to them first. However, WB were cagey about doing a deal, as they thought that Activision had some control over the series. And so Night Dive went to them. Activision were helpful, but they didn't really know. They thought that it was possible they had a claim, but that any records of it predated digital storage. So, you know, somewhere there might be a contract in a dusty box that hasn't been opened for many years. Stephen Kick and Larry Cooperman, the main men at Night Dive doing these negotiations, likened it to the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark. Night Dive look into things further, browse through the public records and so on, and make a claim on the trademark in May of 2014, and this got people quite excited. However, Warner Brothers, still not sure about the whole thing, filed an extension on the trademark shortly after. Not that Night Dive weren't trying to work with WB on the whole thing, they were always on the phone, trying to get something going. However, Warner's response could be described broadly as pessimistic at best, apathetic at worst. As for 20th Century Fox, well, their position was similar to Activision's. They didn't know if they had rights to it or not. Now, Activision are somewhat blameless in this story in that they couldn't really say and basically left it at that. Fox, on the other hand, were different. They offered Night Dive a somewhat crappy deal. Give us some money almost as a sort of guarantee, just so that we can look for our records, and if we don't find anything, then we'll give you that money back. Night Dive didn't take it, and the Fox response was pretty much whatever, with the proviso that if there were much further movement on the release, they'd look themselves, and if they found something, action would be taken. Yay for vague threats of legal action. Speaking of which, another department of Warner Brothers, one not even aware of all the negotiations, sends a threat of legal action over to Night Dive saying that they're aware of the trademark filing and that if they continue to pursue it without negotiating a deal, Warner are going to sue their ass. In legalese anyway. Intimidating though this might have been, it was actually a chance to set the lumbering WB machine that Fussar had contributed nothing to the process into action. Night Dive get in touch with Warner's attorney, make him aware of the current negotiations, and he says that he'll see what can be done. He is actually helpful. Alas, in February of 2015, the hammer ended up falling. Warner finally came back saying that they had no interest in publishing the game themselves, and they had no interest in working with Night Dive. The end. All of Night Dive's efforts, which included the making of some marketing materials as well, came to nothing, and they had no choice but to let their claim on the trademark lapse. You look at this whole story and you really wonder, what on earth is with the total passivity? Surely it's a deal that would require a pretty low amount of effort from WB Games for a nice chunk of change at the end of it. Was it the potential added effort of negotiating with two other big companies to give them their piece of the pie if they had claim to it? Or hey, maybe Monolith have secretly been working on a third game all this time. No, it's probably not that. Instead, you seem to have a case of unnecessary corporate red tape and just pure apathy. The feeling one gets from WB is that, well, they could do something about it. They just don't really want to. Night Dive put a ton into NOLF. They knew how high the demand was, they wanted to fix all the bugs, bring the multiplayer back, include a whole raft of modern features and so forth. essentially create a definitive edition for these two classic games. If, despite all these plans, they weren't able to get anything going, it's hard to see who could. At least, officially. For now, people can still play these classics. The fan community for the games have versions of No One Lives Forever available that allow you to play both 1 and 2 on modern operating systems in all resolutions. I've been using them for this video. They even have multiplayer to boot. Now obviously it's not exactly on the up and up, but let's face it, currently there is no way to give Monolith or any company money for this game. Either you're doing it this way, or you're dusting off an ancient physical copy of the game that you probably bought in a second-hand store and then spending hours trying to get it running. For now, no efforts have been made to take these unofficial versions, which you can certainly find with a cursory web search, out of commission, and hopefully it stays that way. Is it ideal? Well, no. In an ideal world, these two classics are celebrated and happily available on Steam and the like for all. But hey, as I said at the start of this video, the games industry sure does suck at a lot of things. The adventures of Cate Archer may not be cared all that much about by the people who own it, but plenty of people do care. So whatever you do, go out and either revisit these classics or experience them for the first time. What have you got to lose? After all, as the song goes, no one lives forever, and evil never dies. Bye for now. The community gives thanks to the following: Adam Schaefer, Alex Stocco, Andrew Dalton, Andy Capt, Audie Sawley, Conformist, Daniel Briggs, Daniel David Taylor, Dustin Cooper, Gary Pinkett, George Newton, Ghostly Spectre, Guatham Blackpaw, Hunter, Ian Roberts, James Idd, James Loveridge, Jason Durso, Jason Goy, Jason Leach, Jason Stevens, Johan Eriksson, Josh Jensen, Lee Norris, Mark Johnston, Martin Pataki, Morten Scanin, Nanette McCrone, Nicholas Tristan, Olaf Albin, Peter Jack, Peter Sidorn, Phil Taprog, Pocky Southmaid, Rachel Maxwell, Romeo, Ryan Burford, Sammy Lee, Scott Coulter, Sean Zoltek, Seth Robinson, Simon Gulliver, Stephen Warner, The Unnatural, Tanyo J, Yucca Operator, and Zach Roach.